In 1851, the Sierra Nevada foothills held secrets darker than the mines that scarred their faces. Nevada County was a place where men disappeared not just into the earth, but from memory itself. The gold rush had drawn thousands, but it was the silence that followed certain stories that proved most telling. Among the archived records of the Grass Valley Courthouse, discovered during renovations in 1967, lay a collection of documents that painted a picture far removed from the romanticized tales of frontier romance. The case of Clara Elizabeth Wright and Elijah Marcus Powell would become a study in how thoroughly a community could bury its own complicity. The discovery came by accident when workers renovating the courthouse basement found a sealed wooden crate behind a collapsed wall. Inside, wrapped in oiled cloth, were personal effects, correspondence, and witness statements that had been deliberately hidden. The county clerk at the time noted in his official report that the materials appeared to have been placed there sometime in the early 1850s, then forgotten during subsequent renovations. What emerged from those documents was not the story of forbidden love that local folklore had whispered about for generations, but something far more disturbing. Clara Wright had arrived in Grass Valley in the spring of 1851, one of dozens of women who found work in the establishments that served the mining camps. The Golden Nugget Saloon, where she was employed, sat at the corner of Mill and Main Streets, a two-story wooden structure that served liquor, meals, and provided lodging for travelers. The building's registry, preserved in the courthouse archives, shows her name first appearing on May 15, 1851, listed as a server and entertainer. She was 22 years old, originally from Illinois, and according to a letter found among her possessions, had come west after the death of her parents in a cholera outbreak. Elijah Powell's name appears in the Mining Claims Office records 3 days after Clara's arrival. He had filed a counterclaim on a section of Auburn Ravine that was already being worked by the Mason Creek Mining Company. Such disputes were common, but Powell's approach was notably aggressive. He had arrived with surveying equipment and legal documents that challenged not just individual claims, but the company's rights to an entire section of creek bed. The mining registrar's notes, written in careful script, describe Powell as well-dressed and educated, unusual for most claim jumpers who were typically desperate men with little to lose. The first witness statement comes from Martha Henderson, who worked alongside Clara at the Golden Nugget. Her testimony, recorded by Justice of the Peace William Morrison, describes how Powell began visiting the saloon regularly within a week of filing his claim. Unlike most miners who came in groups, drinking heavily and staying late into the night, Powell arrived alone each evening around 6 o'clock. He would sit at a corner table, order a single whiskey, and watch Clara as she moved through the room serving other patrons. Martha noted that he never spoke to Clara directly during these visits, but always left a silver dollar on his table when he departed, far more than the cost of his single drink. The pattern continued for nearly a month. Other employees corroborated Martha's account, describing how Powell's presence seemed to unnerve Clara, though she never complained openly. The saloon's owner, Theodore Blackwood, mentioned in a letter to his brother in Sacramento that one of his girls had attracted the attention of a gentleman, but that the situation made him uneasy. Blackwood noted that Powell asked too many questions about Clara's background and seemed particularly interested in whether she had family or connections in the area. According to the preserved correspondence, the first direct interaction between Clara and Powell occurred on June 20th, 1851. A letter in Clara's handwriting found among her personal effects describes how Powell approached her after the saloon had closed. She had been sweeping the main floor when he knocked on the locked door. Against her better judgment, she let him in. The letter, addressed to a cousin named Sarah in Illinois, describes Powell as charming and well-spoken, but mentions a coldness in his eyes that made her uncomfortable. He had asked if she would walk with him the following evening, and she had agreed, though she could not explain why. The mining company's records reveal that during this same period, Powell's legal challenge to their claim had escalated. Company foreman Robert Manning filed a complaint with the sheriff, stating that Powell had been observed on their property after dark, conducting unauthorized surveys. More concerning were reports from miners that someone had been tampering with their equipment. Tools went missing, support timbers were found loosened, and on one occasion, a section of tunnel had partially collapsed after someone had removed key bracing. No one could prove Powell's involvement, but the timing coincided with his increasingly frequent visits to the Golden Nugget. Martha Henderson's second statement, dated July 3, 1851, describes a change in Clara's behavior. She had become withdrawn, often staring out the saloon's windows toward the hills where Powell's disputed claim lay. Clara had begun working longer hours, volunteering for the late shift when most other employees went home. More troubling, Martha noticed that Clara had started wearing long sleeves even in the summer heat, and seemed to flinch when touched unexpectedly. When Martha asked about her evening walks with Powell, Clara would only say that he was teaching her about the mining business. The correspondence between Powell and an associate in San Francisco, discovered in 1868 when the man's estate was settled, provides insight into Powell's true intentions. In letters dated throughout the summer of 1851, Powell discusses not just his mining claim, but his growing obsession with Clara. He describes her as naive and trusting, qualities he finds both attractive and useful. Most disturbing are references to Clara's lack of family connections, which Powell views as an advantage. He writes about his plans to marry her, but frames the relationship in terms of possession and control rather than affection. The Mason Creek Mining Company's daily logs show that harassment of their operation intensified in July. Miners reported seeing a figure watching them from the ridge above their worksite. Equipment continued to disappear, and there were reports of someone moving through their camp at night. The company hired additional security, but the incidents continued. On July 22nd, a miner named James Crawford was found unconscious near the claim boundary, apparently struck from behind while working alone. Crawford survived, but could remember nothing about the attack. Clara's letters home, which continued sporadically throughout the summer, reveal her growing unease about Powell's behavior. She writes about expensive gifts he had begun giving her, including jewelry and silk scarves that seemed far beyond what a typical miner could afford. More concerning were his suggestions that she leave her job at the saloon and move to a cabin he was building near his claim. Clara mentions feeling pressured but unable to refuse, as if Powell had some undefined hold over her. Her handwriting in later letters becomes increasingly erratic, with several instances where sentences trail off, incomplete. The situation reached a crisis point in early August. According to statements from multiple witnesses, Powell began visiting the Golden Nugget during Clara's work hours, sitting at his usual table but speaking to no one. His presence intimidated other patrons, and several regular customers stopped coming. Theodore Blackwood finally confronted Powell, asking him to conduct his courtship during off hours. Powell's response, as recorded in Blackwood's complaint to the sheriff, was calm but menacing. He suggested that Blackwood mind his own business unless he wanted to face the same difficulties as the mining company. The mining company's troubles had indeed escalated. Their main shaft had flooded after someone diverted a creek during the night. Expensive equipment had been destroyed, and several miners had quit after receiving anonymous threats. Company owner Harrison Mason traveled from San Francisco to assess the situation personally. His report, filed with territorial authorities, describes a systematic campaign of sabotage that went far beyond typical claim disputes. Mason suspected Powell, but lacked concrete evidence, as the man always seemed to have alibis for his whereabouts during incidents. Martha Henderson's final statement, dated August 14th, 1851, describes Clara's last day at the Golden Nugget. Clara had arrived for work appearing exhausted and distressed. She confided to Martha that Powell had insisted she quit her job and move to his cabin immediately. When Clara hesitated, Powell had become angry, describing in detail what would happen to her and her friends if she refused. Martha urged Clara to speak to the sheriff, but Clara insisted that Powell would know and that the consequences would be severe. She worked her shift in silence, then left with Powell when he arrived that evening. The sheriff's investigation, such as it was, began 3 days later when Theodore Blackwood reported Clara missing. Deputy Marshal Frank Collins interviewed Powell, who claimed that Clara had decided to return to Illinois and had taken the stage to Sacramento. He produced a letter, allegedly in Clara's handwriting, stating her intention to go home. Collins noted in his report that the letter seemed authentic, though he had no sample of Clara's writing for comparison. Powell appeared cooperative and expressed his own disappointment at Clara's sudden departure. The mining company's situation deteriorated further in Clara's absence. On August 21st, their equipment shed burned to the ground. 2 days later, a section of their main tunnel collapsed, trapping 2 miners for several hours before they could be rescued. Harrison Mason decided to abandon the claim entirely, selling his equipment at a loss and returning to San Francisco. In his final report, he noted that the harassment ceased immediately after his company's departure, suggesting that the perpetrator had achieved their goal. Powell's claim was validated by the territorial authorities in September 1851. With the mining company gone, there was no longer anyone to contest his rights to the Auburn Ravine section. He established a substantial mining operation, employing several dozen workers and extracting significant quantities of gold over the following months. Local merchants noted that Powell seemed to have unlimited funds for equipment and supplies, far more than any single claim should have generated. He built a large house overlooking the ravine, where he lived alone, despite frequent speculation about his marital intentions. The first hint that Clara's departure might not have been voluntary came in October, when a stage driver named Thomas Riley reported seeing a woman matching Clara's description at Powell's claim. Riley had been delivering supplies and caught a glimpse of someone watching from an upper window of Powell's house. The woman had appeared to be wearing the same blue dress that Clara had worn on her last day at the Golden Nugget. When Riley mentioned this to other drivers, they confirmed similar sightings, always brief and always from a distance. Local opinion about Powell remained divided. His mining operation provided employment and brought money into the area. He attended church regularly and contributed generously to community projects, yet there was an undercurrent of unease among those who remembered the circumstances of Clara's disappearance and the mining company's troubles. The sheriff's office received several anonymous reports about strange sounds coming from Powell's property at night, but no formal investigations were conducted. The winter of 1851 brought unusually heavy snow to the Sierra foothills. Powell's mining operation shut down temporarily, and most of his workers returned to town. The isolation of his house became complete, accessible only by a narrow trail that was often impassable. It was during this period that the most disturbing reports began to surface. Hunters and trappers working in the remote areas around Auburn Ravine reported seeing lights in Powell's windows at all hours and hearing sounds that seemed inconsistent with a single occupant. A particularly detailed account comes from Samuel Morrison, Justice of the Peace, William Morrison's brother, who had been tracking a wounded deer through the hills above Powell's claim. Morrison's statement, recorded months later, describes approaching the house on a February evening in 1852. Through an unshuttered window, he observed Powell, in conversation with someone Morrison could not see clearly. Powell appeared agitated, gesturing emphatically and speaking in raised tones. Morrison reported hearing a woman's voice responding, but could not make out the words. When Powell moved closer to the window, Morrison retreated, fearing discovery. The spring thaw brought renewed activity to the mining district, but Powell's operation remained shuttered. Concerned about tax assessments, the county sent assessor James Montgomery to evaluate Powell's property in April 1852. Montgomery's report describes a well-maintained house and mining infrastructure, but notes that Powell seemed reluctant to allow a full inspection. When Montgomery asked about the unused second floor of the house, Powell claimed it contained only storage. Montgomery noted scratches around the locks on several doors and what appeared to be recent repairs to window frames, but did not investigate further. The truth began to emerge in May 1852, when Powell's behavior became increasingly erratic. Town residents reported that he had begun making frequent trips to Sacramento, sometimes staying away for days. During these absences, his property appeared completely abandoned. More significantly, Powell had begun drinking heavily at the Golden Nugget, often becoming belligerent and making cryptic references to his missing wife. Theodore Blackwood noted that Powell seemed to be searching for something or someone among the saloon's current employees. The investigation that followed was triggered by Powell's own actions. On May 23, 1852, he appeared at the sheriff's office in an agitated state, claiming that someone had broken into his house and stolen valuable papers. Sheriff David Coleman accompanied Powell to examine the property. Coleman's report describes finding obvious signs of hasty departure, with drawers pulled open and personal items scattered throughout the house. More concerning were apparent attempts to clean bloodstains from the wooden floors of the upper rooms. The search of Powell's property revealed evidence that contradicted his account of Clara's voluntary departure. Hidden beneath floorboards in an upstairs room, investigators found Clara's personal effects, including jewelry that witnesses confirmed she had worn regularly. More damning was the discovery of pages torn from what appeared to be a diary, written in Clara's handwriting and describing her captivity in increasingly desperate terms. The entries, dated from August through February, painted a picture of systematic psychological and physical abuse. Powell initially maintained his innocence, claiming that Clara had returned to retrieve her belongings and had chosen to leave the items behind. However, confronted with evidence from the diary pages, he admitted that Clara had remained at his house longer than he had previously stated. According to his confession, recorded by Justice of the Peace Morrison, Clara had agreed to stay as his wife, but had become increasingly unstable and difficult to manage. Powell claimed that Clara's death had been accidental, the result of a fall during one of her attempts to escape. The investigation of Powell's property continued throughout the summer of 1852. Authorities found evidence of extensive modifications to the house's upper floor, including reinforced doors and barred windows that could only be locked from the outside. A hidden room behind a false wall contained additional evidence of Clara's captivity, including chains attached to the walls and personal items that suggested she had been confined for months. The discovery painted a picture far removed from the romantic narrative that local folklore had constructed around their relationship. Powell's trial began in August 1852, presided over by Judge Samuel Williams. The proceedings were extensively documented by court clerk Henry Peterson, whose records provide insight into the community's reaction to the revelations. Many residents had difficulty accepting that someone who had been a respected member of their community could have committed such acts. Powell's defense attorney argued that Clara had been a willing participant in an unconventional relationship, and that her death had indeed been accidental. The prosecution, led by District Attorney Robert Hayes, presented evidence that Powell had planned Clara's abduction from their first meeting. Letters found in Powell's possession revealed his systematic study of Clara's habits and relationships. More damning were business records showing that Powell had purchased supplies and equipment consistent with holding someone against their will. The prosecution argued that Powell had used Clara's isolation and lack of family connections to carry out a calculated crime. Witness testimony painted a picture of Powell as a manipulative individual who had carefully cultivated a respectable public image while concealing his true nature. Former employees described his obsessive attention to detail and his tendency to become violent when contradicted. The mining company's foreman testified about Powell's methodical campaign of intimidation and sabotage. Most damaging was testimony from Thomas Riley and other stage drivers who confirmed that Clara had never taken passage to Sacramento as Powell had claimed. The trial's most compelling evidence came from Clara's own words, preserved in the diary pages found at Powell's property. The entries documented her growing realization that she was trapped, her failed escape attempts, and her eventual resignation to her fate. The final entry, dated February 20th, 1852, expressed her belief that Powell was planning something permanent and her fear that no one would ever know what had happened to her. The diary provided a voice for Clara that challenged every aspect of Powell's defense. Powell was convicted of murder in September 1852 and sentenced to death. However, the execution was delayed when new evidence emerged, suggesting that Powell might have been involved in other disappearances throughout the mining district. Investigators reopened cases involving several missing women, and similar patterns began to emerge. Powell's business records showed unexplained purchases of supplies and equipment that suggested a systematic operation rather than an isolated incident. The expanded investigation revealed that Powell had operated throughout the gold rush territories, using his mining claims as bases for criminal activities. He had developed a network of contacts who helped him identify isolated individuals, particularly women without strong family connections. The sophisticated nature of his operations suggested years of planning and execution. Clara's case had been discovered only because Powell's growing instability had led him to make mistakes. In November 1852, Powell was found dead in his cell, apparently by suicide. He had used bed sheets to hang himself, leaving behind a letter that confessed to multiple murders but provided no details about the locations of other victims. The letter, preserved in the court records, expressed no remorse, but instead complained about his treatment by the community that had once respected him. His death prevented any possibility of learning the full extent of his crimes. The aftermath of Powell's death brought little closure to the community. The mining claim he had fought so hard to obtain was abandoned, as no one wanted to work land associated with such crimes. His house was demolished within a year, but the site remained vacant for decades. Local residents reported that the area never felt quite right, though whether this was due to supernatural influence or simple psychological association remains unclear. The case was officially closed with Powell's death, but questions lingered about other victims and potential accomplices. The sophisticated nature of Powell's operation suggested that he had not worked entirely alone. However, anyone who might have assisted him either had fled the area or remained successfully hidden among the community. The investigation had revealed how easily a predator could operate in the chaos and anonymity of the gold rush. Clara's story became a cautionary tale within the community, though the details were often sanitized in retellings. The romantic narrative of forbidden love proved more palatable than the reality of systematic predation and murder. Local folklore transformed Clara into a tragic figure who had died for love rather than a victim of calculated violence. This transformation served the community's need to believe in its own moral foundations while avoiding uncomfortable questions about its complicity. The documentation of the case was deliberately buried by community leaders who feared that the truth would discourage settlement and economic development. The sealed crate found in 1967 had been placed there by order of the town council, with instructions that it should remain hidden until all those involved were long dead. This decision reflected the community's collective choice to prioritize its future over justice for Clara and other potential victims. Modern analysis of the preserved documents reveals patterns consistent with what would now be recognized as serial predation. Powell's methods showed careful planning and psychological manipulation that went far beyond opportunistic crime. His ability to maintain a respectable public image while committing horrific acts demonstrated the kind of compartmentalization seen in modern criminal profiles. The community's willingness to overlook warning signs reflected social attitudes that made women like Clara particularly vulnerable. The mining district where these events occurred has long since been reclaimed by forest, with little evidence remaining of the gold rush activity that once scarred the landscape. The Auburn ravine runs clear and silent through hills that show no trace of the violence they once witnessed. Yet the silence itself serves as a reminder of how thoroughly a community can erase its own complicity in tragedy when the alternative threatens its comfortable narrative. The records discovered in 1967 were eventually transferred to the California State Archives, where they remain available to researchers studying frontier justice and violence against women in mining communities. Clara's diary pages have been preserved as evidence of both individual tragedy and systemic failure. Her words serve as testimony to experiences that countless other women may have endured in silence during the chaos of westward expansion. The Golden Hills of Nevada County continue to attract visitors drawn by romantic notions of the gold rush era. Tourist brochures speak of adventurous spirits and dreams of fortune, with little mention of the violence that also characterized that period. The sanitized version of history serves commercial interests while obscuring the reality faced by vulnerable individuals like Clara Wright. Her true story remains buried beneath layers of convenient mythology. In the end, Clara's case stands as a reminder that behind every romantic legend lies a more complex truth. The gold rush brought opportunity to many, but it also created conditions that predators could exploit with relative impunity. The community's response to Clara's murder demonstrated how quickly society could choose comfortable lies over difficult truths. The silence that followed her death was not natural, but deliberately constructed and maintained. The hills above Auburn Ravine remain quiet today, disturbed only by the occasional hiker or historian drawn to research forgotten tragedies. The wind through the trees carries no echoes of Clara's voice, silenced now for more than a century. Yet her story persists in the archived documents that survived the community's attempt to bury its shame. In those yellowed pages, written in her own hand, Clara Wright continues to bear witness to truth that others tried desperately to hide. The discovery of Clara's diary pages in 1967 prompted one final investigation. Professor Margaret Stone from the University of California had been researching women's experiences during the gold rush when she encountered the archived documents. Her analysis revealed details that earlier investigators had missed or chosen to ignore. Hidden within Clara's seemingly random observations about daily life were coded references to other women Powell had mentioned, suggesting a network of victims across multiple mining districts. Stone's research uncovered references to similar disappearances in Placer County and El Dorado County during the same period. Women who had vanished without trace, their absences explained away by convenient stories of returns to family or marriages to distant miners. The pattern was consistent enough to suggest coordinated activity rather than isolated incidents. Powell had operated across a territory spanning hundreds of miles, using his legitimate mining activities as cover for systematic predation. The professor's findings were published in a limited academic journal in 1968, but received little attention from the general public. The communities involved had long since moved past their gold rush origins and showed little interest in revisiting uncomfortable aspects of their history. The romantic mythology of the frontier had become too valuable to local identity and tourism to be undermined by scholarly research into forgotten crimes. Clara's grave was never found, despite extensive searches of Powell's property and the surrounding wilderness. Her body had likely been disposed of in one of the many abandoned mine shafts that dotted the landscape, ensuring that she would remain hidden beneath the very earth that had drawn so many seekers to their fortunes and their fates. The gold that Powell had torn from Auburn Ravine carried with it the memory of violence that would never be fully accounted for. The mining claim that had cost so many lives eventually reverted to federal ownership. The Department of Interior classified the area as unstable due to the extensive underground workings and prohibited further development. By the 1970s, the forest had reclaimed most traces of human activity. Only those who knew where to look could find the remains of foundations and the scars left by long-abandoned excavations. Today, hikers occasionally discover fragments of rusted equipment or pieces of broken pottery scattered through the undergrowth above Auburn Ravine. These artifacts serve as silent testimony to the lives that intersected in that remote valley during the turbulent years of the gold rush. Park rangers report that visitors sometimes ask about the history of the area, drawn by local stories that have evolved far from their dark origins into tales of lost love and frontier romance. Clara Elizabeth Wright's name appears on no monument and is remembered in no local museum. Her story exists only in the archived documents that few will ever read and in the academic papers that fewer still will encounter. She remains what she was in life, invisible to a community that preferred comfortable illusions to uncomfortable truths. The silence that surrounded her death has proven more durable than the gold that drew her killer to those hills. The case files were sealed again in 1973, deemed too sensitive for public access during an era of social upheaval. They remain classified in the California State Archives, available only to researchers who can demonstrate legitimate academic purpose. This final act of bureaucratic burial ensures that Clara's voice will continue to be muffled by institutional discretion, just as it was silenced by individual violence more than a century ago. The Golden Hills of Nevada County continue their ancient rhythms, indifferent to the human dramas that played out briefly against their slopes. The creek that Powell diverted still runs its natural course. The forest that has reclaimed his mining operation shows no trace of the violence that once echoed through those canyons. Nature has provided the erasure that the community began and bureaucracy has completed. And perhaps that is the most unsettling truth of all, how completely a life can vanish when those who should remember choose instead to forget. Clara Wright fell not for love, but for the illusion of safety in a world that offered none to women like her. Her real tragedy was not romantic, but social, rooted in a community's willingness to sacrifice individual justice for collective comfort. The silence that followed her death speaks louder than any cry for help she might have made in life.